to Rainbow Records, a show about the stories of queer people who lived through the AIDS crisis in Los Angeles. I'm your host, Analisa Venolia. This episode, our guest is Judy Sisneros. Judy is a lesbian activist, photographer, and curator. She was a member of ACT UP Los Angeles and is currently working to put together oral histories of ACT UP LA's members so that their history is preserved. She shared with me some valuable stories of her experiences as a member of ACT UP LA. So let's get right to it.
My name's Judy Sisneros. I'm in Los Angeles in the Silver Lake neighborhood. I've been here since permanently in Los Angeles since 1987. And I grew up in Bakersfield, California. I was born and raised there. My early 20s, I moved to Northern California, San Jose, then San Francisco, left San Francisco permanently in the early part of 87, or, summer 87, moved here to LA in 87.
And what's your age?
Oh, I'm 70.
What was life like for you as a queer person in the time before the AIDS crisis?
Basically, my whole scene in San Francisco, at least in the late 70s, early 80s, was punk rock. There were a lot of queer punks, but it was very mixed, and it was still majority straight, but I don't remember anyone getting hassled for being queer in the punk scene there. I left in 85 for a year and came to LA. Then I missed San Francisco, so I went back up there for a year or so, and then I came back in 87 permanently. Really coming in contact with queer community was more a late 80s experience because it was just so mixed in San Francisco. But I started finally connecting with people, believe it or not, with the queer community when I started doing clinic defense. So clinic defense is when, there was an organization called Operation Rescue, and they were closing down reproductive clinics, women's family planning clinics, to prevent women from getting abortions, even though some women were going in for birth control or just for their regular annual checks, mammograms. It wasn't just abortions. So I started doing clinic defense, and that's where I connected with people in ACT UP, and they said, you should come to an ACT UP meeting. So that's what I did.
Before we dive into ACT UP, tell me about when you first learned about AIDS.
Well, it was in San Francisco. Of course, I was kind of immersed in the punk scene, and you start to hear disturbing stories about people getting sick and people starting to worry about their health. And I was actually working, 79 to maybe 83. I was working for a messenger company in their office. And one of the other women in the office became a good friend. And she had confided in me that she had done some time incarcerated. And, when I knew her, she's like married, had a child, totally clean. And when I was just trying to remember what year this was, it might have been 1981, I went on vacation. And then when I came home, because in that time you didn't have cell phones, so I had my answer machine on. I came home, I listened to messages, and I had a message from her, and her voice sounded really slurred, and she didn't sound too good. She's like, Judy, call me. I'm in the hospital. I'm sick. Basically, I'm sounding really weird because I'm very sick. But by the time I got to her, which was like later that day or the next day, she was in a coma. And I never talked to her again. I mean, I visited her, but, so she passed away. She had a 3-year-old child. And when I visited her husband, he told me that they think she died from this disease that's going around. And, actually, it must have been after 81, because I think I remember him saying, it's this thing they're calling AIDS, which I think they started using that term in 84.
And how did you feel learning about the virus?
I didn't really know what to do about it, and I didn't really feel like I didn't think at the time to go and volunteer or anything like that. I was just so immersed in my own punk rock world and, I was in my early 20s, so I wanted to have fun even though I was concerned. I did kind of feel helpless.
Gotcha. So now tell me about how you got involved with ACT UP.
Let's see, I was going to these clinic defense events, and it was interesting, and actually I just wanna preface going into ACT UP because the people in Operation Rescues and their supporters were threatening. They would be like these supposedly pro-life people. They would drive by and say, "If I had a gun, I'd shoot you." It was stuff like that. Or, there were times when you're trying to keep the door open, you're locked arms with your, activist friends, and they're crawling on the ground under you, trying to get to the door. And sometimes the men are grabbing at you, your legs, your bottom, because they're trying to get you to react, which, you kind of do. And it was kind of a constant battle. I think because I was able to, for the most part, hold my place. Some of the guys in ACT UP that were doing clinic defense were saying, "Well, you should come to ACT UP. You're gonna meet a lot of people and we need help." So I did start to go to meetings. My first meeting, I remember it was overwhelmingly male. Like, I think there were 2 women in it, but I kept going, and then eventually, a few more women, and this was in the spring of 1990. So the very first committee I got involved with, which started basically just as I was joining, was the Women's Caucus of Los Angeles. So, we had a separate meeting at the ACT UP Los Angeles office, which was in Silver Lake, right at the corner of Sunset and Hyperion or Sanborn. But just so you know, ACT UP LA met regularly at Plummer Park in West Hollywood every Monday night at 7:30. So that's where the bulk of the membership would meet. Once a week, it would be what they called general meetings, where everyone would show up, and if you were in a committee, the head of the committee at that time, because they rotated every 3 months, would give a report on what's going on. Committees would also meet off-site during the week. I was in the Women's Caucus. There was also Agitating Legal, the people who did logistics and planning for demonstrations. There was people who were focused on public policy, treatment and data committee. There was the art committee. Eventually, there was a committee called PWOC-U, Prisoners with AIDS Advocacy Committee United, because we did a lot of work around prisoners with AIDS.
Describe for me what motivated you to join ACT UP. Was it your clinic defense friends? Was the AIDS crisis just impossible to ignore? Tell me about it.
I don't think it was just that I met these people at Clinic Defense. You have to remember that it was a major issue just in society in general. It was on the media, you would see it in print, magazines, newspapers. There was constant, it was almost like war reporting. When I was a kid, in the 60s and the Vietnam War was going on, and you watch the news every day, they'd be like, X amount of troops died today. It was like every day. And that's the way it was when AIDS was going on. You would hear every day, "We've got this report that so and so died." I mean, maybe not to the extent that it was on a daily report on national news, but it was definitely weekly, and it was exacerbated by the fact that didn't happen with the Vietnam War, is that you've got this hateful rhetoric coming out of the government, out of religious institutions, cultural institutions, people who didn't care, they deserve what they got, very hateful, and it was, like, intense. So that was always on my radar when the AIDS crisis started. It was not lost on me. It was not just because my friends Sal and Jerry saying, "You should join ACT UP." Actually, even before, because 'cause I'd gone to a vigil with a friend. ACT UP LA was having a week-long vigil where they were camping out and doing guerrilla theater, having speeches, doing messaging around the issue of the lack of an AIDS ward in Los Angeles County. So if you were sick and had to be hospitalized, basically you were dying in the hallways. the LA County Board of Supervisors was not giving any money to fund the healthcare services or the county, health agencies to help people with AIDS. So, it's been a long time, but probably all of those things were a motivating factor.
Could you tell me about ACT UP LA's specific goals?
Okay, so I didn't join ACT UP when they first formed in 1987, so I didn't join till 1990. What I could see and understand and learned that the focus was, first of all, for the AIDS ward, okay, which eventually did happen. But you have to realize that we also participated in national actions because federal funding for AIDS impacted money in Los Angeles. Also, at the same time, there were issues around what the CDC was doing. Yes, they're based in Atlanta. Okay, that's the Centers for Disease Control. Now it's called the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And so, what the ACT UP Women's Caucus did, which impacted Los Angeles women, we joined the national campaign, which other ACT UP chapters also did, to expand the definition of AIDS to include women's opportunistic infections. So basically, what was happening is that for you to get an AIDS diagnosis and have access to potentially life extending services, you had to get that AIDS definition. Women, some of their infections are different from men. So we joined that campaign and we went to Atlanta in December of 1990 and had a huge demonstration at the CDC to get them to expand the definition to include women's opportunistic infections.
And what was it like as a woman in ACT UP LA?
There was a lot of respect for the women. One thing is that I think the men in the group could see how dedicated the women were to the cause. The other thing that I'm sorry I didn't mention sooner was that one of the women who joined ACT UP around the time of the start of the ACT UP Women's Caucus in June of 1990 had just gotten out of Frontera prison. She was a woman with an AIDS diagnosis, and she and her partner came to meetings and said, "We need your help because women who are HIV infected or women with AIDS are being kept in solitary. The guards, when someone dies, they won't come and take the person right away. They didn't even want to bring food to the person because they were afraid they would get infected." It was horrendous. And so ACT UP LA came on board with doing something around prisoners with AIDS. So I think that the combination of wanting to help women with AIDS, also seeing how dedicated women were to helping the cause, was a part of the acceptance of women in the group. Clinic defense was still going on while I was in ACT UP. So that might have been the only thing that might have been a little divisive at times, because some men wanted to just say, "It's our group's about AIDS." But then there were so many men that understood that if the government can control what women do with their bodies, they can come in and tell gay people how to have sex. Not just how to have sex, if they can have sex.
Is there a protest you participated in that stands out in your mind?
Dare I bring it up? The AB 101 veto protests. What happened was in September of 1991, the ACT UP network, led mainly by ACT UP LA, decided to do a national action at the US Congressional Building to advocate for universal health care. Because we really felt strongly, and I still greatly believe in universal health care, that if everyone has equal access to health care, and if you can bring up the people on the lowest rung of healthcare, that would lift everyone else up, and usually those people were considered homeless, the prisoners, and undocumented. And if you had universal healthcare for everyone, that would bring up health care for all those people who don't necessarily have access. And, of course, it would make everyone healthier in the whole country. So anyway, we had a plan for universal health care. We did a huge action. And we actually, in the rotunda of the US Congress building, I got arrested, in the same place where the January 6th people, but, we didn't smash windows, spread crap on the walls. We didn't do any of that. We just went in and did a sit-in, got arrested, and were taken to the DC jail. I believe the action was on October 1st. We'd gotten to DC that weekend, either the Friday or the Saturday. And that Sunday, which was the 30th, I believe, was when then California Governor Pete Wilson vetoed an assembly bill that was passed by the assembly called AB 101. It was to prevent job discrimination for gay people in employment. Well, he had run for governor the year before. One of his campaign promises is he would sign it. He ended up vetoing the bill. The majority of ACT UP LA was in DC when this happened. So this broke on the news, and I'm speaking from a person who was out of town, and it was on national news that huge protests were taking place in San Francisco and Los Angeles because of this veto. This was a massive outpouring of people coming out of the bars. These are people who would normally just, okay, I'm just going to stay in the bar and drink. And they hit the streets. So this was on national news every day for at least a week. Some of the people who got arrested in DC couldn't go back right away. Well, none of us could go back right away because we all had different court dates to deal with our arrest. Mine wasn't until the following Friday. A couple of people went back anyway, knowing they could never go back to DC, supposedly, because they skipped out on their court hearing. But most people stuck around. And so slowly during the week, people were going back. By Friday night, I was in the thick of the protests on the street. And it was kind of like no one was in charge, but it was also it wasn't anarchy necessarily. It was different groups that were very visible, like, ACT UP, Queer Nation, the Center. There was a group called League America, which was kind of more moderate, not as kind of more moneyed people went to that group, kind of just like they would have meetings, gay people with money that had meetings and like, what can we do for the community? But they hit the streets. GLUE, Gay and Lesbianas Unidos, Bien Star, which was the Latino AIDS Health Service Organization, all the community groups were a part of it. People were marching in different neighborhoods. People marched on Beverly Hills when the governor came to town to speak at LACMA. Like hundreds of people showed up outside and did a sit-in during the UCLA law commencement ceremony. People showed up there and protested. People marched at LAX, on Ventura Boulevard, in Silver Lake, in Hollywood, and downtown, like for weeks. There were a couple of big demonstrations that were particularly noticeable. In late October, there was a big GOP meeting, Republican meeting. The governor, George Bush, who was president at the time, and other, Republican people. And so there was a huge protest in Century City where the meeting was being held, at the Century Plaza Hotel. I'm not sure how many people were there, but it was several hundred. And what happened was the LAPD showed up on horses. And people at the time in Century City, I believe it still is, there was a kind of a grassy median. And there were people on the grassy knoll, not the one in Texas, with signs, chanting, yelling. There's a fountain in the middle. People were standing on the fountain. And the LAPD showed up in horses. They asked people to leave. Of course, we wouldn't. And then they started charging into the crowd on horses, hitting people with batons. People started screaming. During these AB 101 veto protests, a lot of people who were not normally activists were showing up. So this may have been one of the first times that many of them ever had a confrontation with a police line. So anyway, people started running. I saw this news reporter from one of the stations standing in the crowd with people running, the horses all around, cops hitting people. She was like, "I can't believe this is happening. I can't believe it. I can't believe it." She was not on camera. And then I remember a few minutes later seeing a cop grab her and throw her into bushes. I myself ran down to the Century City Mall, and right outside I would call it the southeast corner, right outside of Bloomingdale's, there was a group of us that got surrounded by cops, and somehow I slipped away, but not before I saw this cop. I mean, and we were just standing there, a little panicky, but I saw a cop just take his baton and just whack this one woman on the side of the head, and she just, like, down she went, like, totally knocked out. The other thing is that some people had run into Bloomingdale's, and some of the clerks were hiding them behind the counter, which was really cool. So, anyway, somehow I made it back to West Hollywood, and, that resulted in a lawsuit, Marmillion versus, LAPD, and eventually a number of people who were beaten and injured during that what we call a police riot ended up winning a lawsuit for $400,000. There were about 20 people that were plaintiffs, and they ended up winning a lawsuit eventually against the LAPD for that.
That's absolutely crazy. Um, it seems like ACT UP LA did so much. How did you sustain momentum for so many years? That couldn't have been easy.
Well, okay, so ACT UP LA actually ended in 1997, but frankly, I think that a lot of the momentum and attention to the organization kept going because people were dying. As much as the state wanted to ignore it, they couldn't. It wasn't easy. There was a lot of attrition, tons of people died. I'm not so sure it kept going, but I think the message that ACT UP has, the reputation that it has is because of the risk that people were willing to take when they were in the organization, getting arrested. And it wasn't just like a vigil at the hospital. Members of ACT UP LA were going into the LA County Board of Supervisor meetings more than once, several times, disrupting it, demanding funding, disrupting, getting arrested. That was on the news. There were a lot of smaller events that maybe, didn't always get as much attention as some of the larger actions, but it was relentless. In Los Angeles, you have to drive or get on a bus, usually from a long distance. In New York or San Francisco, someone could say, "We're an emergency action," or whatever, and people would jump on, in San Francisco, the BART or the Muni, or in New York, the subway, and they would be able to mobilize quickly. Not LA. We had to do a lot more planning, logistics around the locations that we decided to target. So, that made it more difficult, but still, some people showed up after taking buses from Torrance. There was incredible people that were dedicated to the cause.
And looking back, how do you feel about your participation in ACT UP LA?
I'm very proud of what we did. No regrets whatsoever. I would do it again. I made a lot of friends. I made lifelong friends. I'm still friends with many people. I'm very proud of what we did. It was not easy. It could be scary. It could be frustrating. It was not a party. It was difficult as hell. I think we did help save some people's lives. Some people we didn't, and that they missed the antiretroviral drugs coming out, some of them by just mere months. If they could have stuck it out a little bit longer, they might still be here today, but their bodies would not let them. I think especially with Los Angeles and the work we did, we're overlooked by New York and, to a certain extent by San Francisco, but I think we have our own contributions locally and to the state and to the national movement that shouldn't be ignored.
With all of your experience, is there a message you want to share with queer people living through the current moment?
I would say even though we do things differently today with social media, back then we didn't have social media, that if you persevere you can create change. You've got to figure out, however, what you're wanting to do. It's not really what you're capable of doing immediately because you could always learn how to do certain things that you want to do. That's what I did. But resist what's going on today, speak about it, learn about what's going on, and try to connect with other like-minded people. It doesn't have to be hundreds of people, it could be a smaller group, and try and do some kind of acts of resistance and speaking out. You're not ever too young to do that. And you're not ever too old to do that either, even if you've never been an activist in your life. With ACT UP, a lot of people in the organization didn't have an activist past. Some people came out of the anti-nuclear movement. Some people came from the labor movement, various unions. Some people came just because my friends are dying. I've never been an activist. Or I'm seeing that people are dying. Maybe no one I know, but I see that this is not fair and it's horrendous and I want to do something. So if you have that motivation and you don't like what's going on, learn as much as you can, figure out what you can do, and just go for it. Try and connect with people.
You're never too young or too old to get involved. Thank you, Judy Sisneros, for sharing your story and your advice. This has been Rainbow Records. Until next time.